The account that Diane Carroll Hartley gave to hypnotherapist Dr. Evelyn Marsh in a series of recorded sessions conducted in Indianapolis, Indiana, between March and September of 1983, does not appear in the mainstream literature of abduction research. It surfaced in an appendix of Marsh's self-published monograph on regression therapy and anomalous experience, printed in a run of 240 copies in 1986. Most of those copies are gone. Hartley herself, a licensed practical nurse who spent 22 years working overnight shifts at Deaconess Hospital in Evansville, Indiana, asked that her name not be used during her lifetime. She died in 2011 at the age of 67. What she described in those sessions, the specific, unhurried, almost methodical nature of what the beings had removed from her, and the exact shape of the hollow they left behind, is one of the most precise accounts in the documented record of what researchers working outside the institutional literature have come to call retrieval. Not abduction, not examination, retrieval. The distinction mattered to Hartley. She insisted on it from her first session with Marsh and maintained it consistently across every conversation that followed. She had been taken twice before, she explained, once in 1968 and again in 1973. She had read nothing on the subject before arriving at Marsh's office. She had not sought out researchers or support networks or any of the communities that had, by the early 1980s, begun to gather around this particular kind of testimony. She had come to Evelyn Marsh, a therapist she found through a colleague at Deaconess, because she could not account for a specific and persistent symptom that had begun in the winter of 1979. A recurring awareness that certain memories, particular ones, bounded and precise, were simply no longer where she had left them. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Not faded. Not distorted in the way memory distorts across time. Absent. She could describe the outer edges of those memories with considerable accuracy. She could identify what had preceded them and what followed. She could name the room, the season, the approximate year. What she could not recover was the interior. They were gone differently than ordinary forgetting removes things. No fragments survived at the edges, no impressions lingered at the perimeter, just the outline remaining, precise and empty, the address with the contents gone. It was this quality of absence, its precision and cleanliness, that Marsh found clinically significant enough to document in full. In her notes from the first session, dated March 7, 1983, she described Hartley as presenting with what she called a catalogued loss, a woman who knew, with unusual specificity, what she no longer possessed. 22 years of overnight shifts had built in Hartley a discipline of careful attention, chart reviews, medication logs, the procedural accountability of a working nurse, and that same discipline appeared to have turned inward. She could describe the exact shape of what was missing. She simply could not reach inside it. Marsh wrote in her case notes that Hartley was not a person given to unexplained experience. She simply had not, until January of 1979, encountered an absence large enough to force the question. Hartley was standing approximately 40 inches from her bedroom window when it began. She knew the distance because she had measured it afterward, standing in the same spot on a subsequent January night, trying to place herself precisely. It was the third week of January 1979. Gerald was asleep in the room behind her. She had woken without knowing why, with the particular clarity of someone roused, not by sound, but by a change in the quality of the room itself. The silence came first. She described this to Marsh without any prompting, before she had any framework for understanding why it would matter, before she had learned that what she was about to say was something other witnesses in other states and other years had reached for the same words to describe. The house had gone quiet, she said, but the quiet was wrong. The refrigerator in the kitchen, audible from their bedroom on cold nights, had stopped. The furnace had stopped. The low, continuous hum she had lived with for so long it was functionally invisible to her conscious attention had ceased completely, and in the space left behind, There was a silence so absolute and so particular that it felt less like the absence of sound and more like the arrival of something else. She turned to the window. The light outside was wrong, not street light, not a neighbor's fixture, not any reflection off the snow in the yard below. Something colder and more even, a light that appeared to originate from no particular source and cast no shadows. She stood at the window for what she estimated at approximately 40 seconds. She could not later explain why she had not turned to wake Gerald. The thought had not occurred to her. Then she was no longer in her room. The transition carried no sense of movement or physical transport between one location and another. One moment, the bedroom window and the flat, cold light. The next, a space she could describe only by what it lacked, neither large nor small, with surfaces that absorbed rather than reflected whatever illumination the room contained. What she noticed first was not the beings who were present, or the temperature, which she described as neutral past the point of being perceptible. What she noticed first was that her own life appeared to have been removed from her and set down in the room for examination. The images came to her as images, though she consistently distinguished what she was seeing from memory as it replays in the ordinary sense. These were external. They occupied the space between herself and the beings she could perceive at some distance from her, as if something had been carefully extracted from her and arranged there. She recognized them immediately. A moment from her childhood in Terre Haute, a kitchen, her mother's hands turning the pages of something. A specific afternoon from her first year at Deaconess, a patient she had sat with for reasons she had never quite been able to articulate, whose face she had thought about across many years. Her wedding day, but not the ceremony, a private moment before it, in a hallway, when she and Gerald had stood looking at each other without speaking, and she had known, with a completeness that required no deliberation, that what she was doing was right. These were not her most significant memories by any conventional measure. They were not the defining events or the wounds or the moments any outside observer would have selected to represent the arc of her life. They were, as she described them, the ones that felt most entirely and exclusively hers. The ones that existed nowhere except inside her, that could not have been reconstructed from any documentation of her life, any external record of any kind. One of the beings stood closer than the others. She described 3 present. The nearest she estimated at just under 4 feet, grey skin with a quality she struggled to characterize precisely, something dry in its appearance and yet suggesting illumination from within, eyes that occupied a proportion of the face that seemed to exceed what the geometry of a head that size should allow. The being never touched her. She was explicit about this across every session Marsh conducted. It maintained a distance she estimated at 6 to 8 feet throughout, and the externalized memories appeared to shift and respond in ways she could not account for, as if something it was directing at them was deepening them, the way sustained precise attention deepens a thing being examined. The communication, such as it was, came through the eyes, not words, not gesture, an awareness conveyed through the quality of the attention being directed at her and at what had been taken from her, that what was occurring was purposeful and had been planned before she arrived in that space. The specific memories being examined had been identified in advance. There was an accounting somewhere of what she held, and what she was experiencing was the collection of items already marked on it. She had a sense, she told Marsh in their 3rd session, of being taken seriously in a way she had never before associated with anything she found frightening. The beings were not curious, they were thorough. Hartley's account would be a single extraordinary claim from a single night shift nurse in a winter bedroom in Indiana, except that the pattern it describes runs through the documented record with a consistency too specific to treat as coincidence. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What she described in session after session, as Marsh approached the same territory from different angles over the course of months, was not the sensation of something torn from her. She described a precision she could only liken to surgical extraction, a removal so complete and so deliberate that what surrounded the taken material was left intact. The memories were removed cleanly. What remained was the outline, exact and empty. She used the word practiced. It felt practiced in the way a procedure performed many times is practiced, not hesitant, not exploratory, but executing the established approach with the efficiency of long familiarity. She woke in her bedroom at 4:17 in the morning by the clock on her nightstand. Gerald had not been disturbed. The refrigerator was running again, the furnace was cycling. Nothing in the room had been physically displaced. She lay in the dark for approximately an hour before she accepted that the gap between waking at the window and waking in her bed was not something she was going to resolve through any explanation she had available. She was a nurse. She understood what the mind does to close legitimate gaps. This was not that. The memories were gone. She did not go to the police. She did not tell Gerald for 3 years. She arrived at Evelyn Marsh's office in the spring of 1983, carrying a precise and itemized accounting of what was absent. The way a person describes a break-in, not by what the intruder left behind, but by naming exactly what was taken and from where. David Jacobs, the Temple University historian who conducted hundreds of hypnotic regression sessions with abductees over several decades, noted in his research from the early 1990s that a significant number of his subjects described what he carefully characterized as selective memory interaction during their reported encounters. The beings were examining what those bodies held, the accumulated interior record of specific human lives. Jacobs used the word cataloging deliberately because he had heard it used, in approximately that form, by subjects in regression who had no knowledge of each other and no access to each other's sessions. A truck driver named Warren Colby, 63 at the time of his only publicly documented interview, conducted by researcher Andreasson in Bakersfield, California, in the spring of 1991, described an encounter from the summer of 1984 that mapped onto Hartley's account with a precision difficult to explain by any available alternative. Colby had been awake and pulled over beside a highway outside Barstow. He described the silence arriving in the cab of his truck, the instruments going dark, and then the same transition Hartley had described, one location, then another, with no perceived movement between them. In the space he found himself in, arranged around him as if placed there for study, were what he characterized not as images but as feelings, specific emotional states from his past, present in the room as external objects. What the beings appeared to be attending to, he said, was not the event layer of his memories but the feeling layer beneath them. Not what had happened to him, but what it had been like to have it happen. His father's death, not the facts of it, but the grief of it, present in the room between him and the nearest being, as if grief were a thing with weight and dimension. The first time he had trusted someone completely and been betrayed, the emotional texture of that moment separated from its narrative and available for examination on its own terms. When it was finished, he told Druffel, he could feel the moment each one was removed. He used a phrase that has stayed with me. Like closing a door in a room you can no longer enter. The room still exists. You know it is there. You cannot go back inside. Colby told Druffel that he had disclosed his account once before to the commander of his local Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter, a man he declined to name. Within approximately 1 week of that conversation, 2 men visited his home. They identified themselves as affiliated with a federal agency, giving a name he had not caught clearly. The questions they asked indicated prior knowledge of what he had reported. They asked, in particular, whether the emotional states he described as having been removed were still absent. He confirmed that they were. They made a notation, thanked him, and left. He received no further contact. He described all of this in the flat tone of someone who has made a long peace with the fact that something happened for which no available framework provides a satisfying account. The pattern across these accounts does not suggest random or indiscriminate collection. Whatever the Greys are taking, the testimony indicates consistently that the selection is predetermined and organized according to criteria invisible to the person from whom the material is taken. What they appear to be collecting is not knowledge in any conventional sense, not information that exists in books or records or anything accessible from outside the specific human being who holds it. What they appear to be collecting is what belongs entirely to the interior, the emotional and experiential content of individual lives, the dimension of human experience that has never been successfully preserved by any method available to the people who live it. Betty Andreasson Luca, whose 1967 encounter in South Ashburnham, Massachusetts, is among the most thoroughly studied in the abduction literature, described in her sessions with researcher Raymond Fowler a phase of her experience in which the beings appeared focused not on what she had done or experienced, but on what she had felt about those experiences. The emotional substrate. Fowler noted that this aspect of her testimony received significantly less attention than the procedural elements, despite appearing consistently across years of session work. The omission is characteristic of how this entire thread has been handled. The documented literature has directed most of its effort toward physical procedures, the examinations, the biological material, the implants, the mechanics of transport. What it has largely set aside is what may be the central activity, the one for which everything else exists as preparation. If the memories are what is taken, if the interior emotional record of specific human lives is what the encounters are organized to reach, then the physical procedures are scaffolding. The retrieval is what the scaffolding is built to support. What does a species do with the specific grief of a truck driver from Bakersfield? With the emotional record of a night shift nurse from Evansville? With the interior experience of thousands of individual human lives, collected across decades of contact that the official record has consistently declined to acknowledge? The simplest possibility is that they are assembling an archive, a record of what it is to be human from the inside, not observed behavior, not literature or art that approaches interior experience from the outside, but the experience itself, taken at the source. No method we have ever developed has managed to preserve what it actually feels like to live a human life from within it. Whatever these beings are doing, the testimony suggests they may have found that method and have been applying it with purpose for considerably longer than any individual account in the record can bracket. There is a further element to this, appearing at the margins of several accounts, whose consistency is harder to explain than to dismiss. Multiple witnesses describe a moment near the conclusion of the retrieval that carries a quality unlike anything else they report from their encounter. Hartley described it in her 4th session with Marsh. Once the removal was complete, she said, the beings appeared to hold what they had collected for a sustained period. During that time, something in the quality of the room changed. She used the word warmer, though she was careful to say she did not mean temperature. She described a sense that the memories taken from her were becoming, in some way she could not articulate, more than they had been when they existed only inside her, as if being received by beings capable of this quality of attention had given them a dimension they had lacked as private interior experience. She did not get them back. She was unambiguous about this across every session, but she described carrying from that night forward a wordless awareness that what had been taken was not destroyed, it had gone somewhere, and wherever that was, it was being kept in a way that her own biological memory, with its eventual decay, could never have guaranteed. Katharina Wilson, who documented her own experiences across a series of published accounts in the 1990s, described a moment in one of her encounters that maps onto this with a precision difficult to attribute to coincidence. At the conclusion of what the beings were doing, she said, one of them had turned back toward her, and for a moment she received an impression she could only characterize as scale, not an image, not a communication in any sense she recognized, but a brief involuntary perception of something enormous and carefully organized that had been accumulating for longer than she had any framework to reckon with. Not the contents of an archive, she said, the fact of one, that it existed, that it was vast, that it was maintained with the same precision the beings brought to everything she had witnessed. She described this in two separate accounts, separated by several years. The language in both is close enough to indicate the same impression being described, not a story elaborating over time. Gerald Hartley, reached by telephone in the winter of 2022, 11 years after Diane's death, described with the patience of an old man who has had a long time to sit with something he still does not entirely understand, that his wife in the years following 1979 had developed what he called a changed relationship with the past. Not a damaged one, changed. She had become more precise about what mattered, less interested in what she had accumulated, more attentive to small private experiences she could still access, and acutely aware of the shape of the ones that were no longer there. What she described, consistently, until she died, was not distorted memory or faded recollection. It was the topology of something taken, the documentation that might help account for any of this, whatever records were generated by the kinds of federal visits Colby described in Bakersfield, or by classified programs that have been partially acknowledged across multiple countries' declassification processes, is not accessible. The official conversation about these encounters, such as it has developed over the past 2 decades, has concerned itself with craft, flight characteristics, physical evidence of technology operating in restricted airspace, radar records. It has not, in any public or declassified form, approached the question of what happens inside those craft. What is taken, what is done with what is taken, where it goes. The conversation stops at that threshold with a consistency that begins, after sufficient time with this material, to feel less like absence and more like method. Diane Carroll Hartley spent the final years of her life volunteering in a hospice program, sitting with people in the last weeks of theirs. Her daughter Ellen described her mother as someone who had arrived over time at something in the vicinity of acceptance, not peace, Ellen was clear about that, but a kind of attentive resignation. She had decided, Ellen said, that whatever the beings were assembling, whatever she had contributed to it across those January hours in 1979, it was at minimum a record. A real record of a real life, kept somewhere, by someone, for reasons that remained entirely beyond her ability to see. She was not comforted by this, but she had stopped being only afraid of it. If what the testimony describes is real, if what is happening across these encounters, documented across 7 decades and 6 continents by witnesses who did not seek each other out, is the systematic collection of human interior experience taken at the source, then what has been accumulated is something we have no framework to measure. An archive of what it is to be human, kept outside our institutions, organized according to principles we cannot read, maintained by beings whose purposes remain, across every account we have, beyond any explanation the official silence has so far produced. The testimony keeps arriving at the same place from different directions. Hartley in Indiana, Colby outside Barstow, Wilson across a series of documented accounts spanning more than a decade. The same quality of attention directed at interior experience, the same selectivity of removal, the same impression conveyed to witnesses who had no contact with each other, that what was taken had not simply ceased to exist, that it had arrived somewhere, and that what had been private and irreplaceable when it belonged to a single human life had become, in being received, part of something with a duration and a scale that no individual witness could fully see. Whatever the Greys do with the memories they take, the evidence suggests they have been doing it for a long time, with a care that does not resemble accident. The archive, if that is what it is, has been built deliberately. The entries in it were chosen. And the scope implied by the testimony, the decades of contact, the geographic range, the consistency of the method across witnesses who had no knowledge of each other, suggests a purpose with a weight and a duration entirely out of proportion to anything we have been told. The record does not say what that purpose is. What it shows is what was taken, and the shape of what remains. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.